The Flaxborough Museum's Decorative Arts Committee had achieved, after a quarter of an hour of vigorous nodding, the unusual condition of unanimous agreement. This agreeable moment concerned the ordering of 3 new brass picture rails, an item so uncontroversially dull that even Mrs. Glossop, who could locate drama in a teapot's glaze, found nothing in it worth opposing. The chairman, Mr. Cyril Maudsley, allowed himself the indulgence of a satisfied sigh, though very quietly, as satisfaction in public bodies was considered unbecoming. It was at this exact instant, when calm had settled upon Flaxborough's most respectable circle of amateur aesthetes, that Miss Honoria Fenn, retired music teacher and habitual volunteer, entered the committee room with a face that suggested she had discovered a moral catastrophe in the broom cupboard. "Mr. Maudsley? The tapestry," she whispered, as though the word itself might unsettle furniture. "It is already hanging." This remark caused a general stirring of cardigans and spectacles. Mrs. Glossop, scenting opportunity, straightened importantly. "Hanging?" she repeated, drawing the word out like a misplaced accusation. "But we haven't unveiled it yet." Miss Fenn shook her head with the solemnity of a church organist announcing the wrong hymn. "No one has unveiled anything. I found it in the main gallery. It's up." Up! The committee absorbed this with a level of horror ordinarily reserved, in Flaxborough, for late library returns. Mr. Maudsley blinked several times. "But who, Miss Fenn, placed it there? The tapestry was meant to remain in storage until Friday's presentation." "I couldn't say." Miss Fenn clasped her hands as though the unknown installer might leap from behind a sarcophagus at any moment. There was a pause thick enough to spread on toast. Then Mrs. Glossop, armed with resolve and the sort of handbag that made curators nervous, declared, "We must inspect it at once." The procession to the main gallery had something of the air of a small parish funeral, complete with frowns of appropriate solemnity. The gallery was cool, faintly echoing, and occupied solely by the tapestry in question, an elaborately embroidered Edwardian wall hanging depicting a tranquil garden scene, or at least mostly depicting one. A space roughly the size of a pocket square had been cut out of the lower corner. "Oh, my word!" breathed Mr. Maudsley. "Vandalism!" "Not vandalism," corrected Mrs. Glossop helpfully. "Surgery." Purbright, had he been present at that moment, might have inquired after the surgeon's motives, but Inspector Purbright at this hour was analysing a jam-stained ledger at the police station, and would only be summoned once the committee reached the conclusion that the incident represented a threat to civilization. "Who would do such a thing?" demanded Miss Fenn, clutching her scarf like an emotional flotation device. "Well," Mrs. Glossop began, with the eager caution of someone simultaneously aware that she should not speculate and profoundly hoping to do so, "someone has been at it with scissors, crude scissors at that." The cut was indeed not elegant, threads frayed outward in short, panicked tufts. "But why only that portion?" wondered Mr. Maudsley. "Why not a larger section, or the whole tapestry?" No one answered. The tapestry loomed before them, innocent in every respect except for its missing patch, a patch that had contained, according to the tiny photograph attached to the donor's letter, a small but ornate embroidered motif. What the motif represented had escaped the committee's attention, as the letter had concerned itself mostly with flowery appreciations and the donor's recollection of dear mother's impeccable taste in domestic ornaments. Mrs. Glossop stepped closer and sniffed, an investigative technique she had developed independently. "Lavender," she announced. "Cheap lavender." This caused uncertain glances. Lavender, whether cheap or refined, was abundant in Flaxborough, chiefly on the dressing tables of women of a certain age who believed it discouraging to insects and men alike. Miss Fenn suddenly clasped a hand to her mouth. "Do you think," she whispered, "that someone wished to prevent us from seeing whatever was in that corner?" Given that nobody present had previously taken more than a passing interest in the motif, this possibility seemed to electrify them. Mrs. Glossop drew herself up. "It may be connected to that business with the watercolour 2 months ago." "Which business was that?" asked Mr. Mousley. "The one where the curator found it hanging 3 inches higher than before." "That was attributed to humidity," murmured Miss Fenn. "Humidity," said Mrs. Glossop with disdain, "does not climb step-ladders." It was at this point that someone suggested, reluctantly, that the police might be consulted. Not urgently, of course. Flaxborough prided itself on avoiding fuss, but discreetly, perhaps with the understanding that no one was accusing anyone, though suspicions naturally existed, but only in the gentlest, most civic-minded spirit. Thus, Inspector Purbright was telephoned. The inspector arrived 20 minutes later, polite as ever, hat in hand and expression one of mild curiosity. He listened to their accounts, asked a few unhurried questions, and studied the tapestry without touching it. "Interesting," he said, which for Purbright was equivalent to another man shouting, "Good heavens!" He leaned closer to the frame. "You say it was not hung by any member of the committee?" Several people assured him emphatically that they were far too busy, too respectable, or too arthritic to have done any such thing. "And the missing portion?" Purbright continued. "Did anyone notice it earlier today?" They had not. They admitted, looked closely at the tapestry at all. Purbright nodded with the slow, polite understanding of a man accustomed to community organizations that rarely observe their own exhibits. "I suspect," he said, "that someone wished you to notice this only now." The committee exchanged glances that ranged from troubled to theatrically appalled. "But why?" Miss Fenn whispered. Purbright smiled very slightly. "That," he said, "is what we shall try to determine." Rumour, in Flaxborough, had always shown a commendable sense of punctuality. By the time Inspector Purbright left the museum and strolled the short distance toward the High Street, the tapestry's mutilation had already travelled ahead of him and installed itself in several shop doorways, 2 tea rooms, and, rather impressively, the post office queue. That queue, being long and composed chiefly of retired individuals who regarded their daily dispatch of envelopes as a patriotic duty, served as the town's most efficient information exchange. Mr. Scroton, the postmaster, possessed a keen skill for appearing not to listen while listening thoroughly. As Purbright passed by the open doorway, Scroton's voice drifted out. "They say it's an indecency someone's cut out, something suggestive." The inspector was tempted to step in and ask where this suggestion had originated, but he knew better. Rumour, like yeast, grew best without excessive kneading. Across the road, in Blackerby's stationery, 2 committee members, though neither willing to admit having seen the other, happened to be purchasing envelopes of identical size. Their murmured conversation, veiled in genteel outrage, drifted over the shelves of notebooks and fountain pen cartridges. "Well, Clara, I heard it was a sort of coat of arms," whispered one. "Oh, no, Edith, nothing of the sort. It was an emblem, something foreign, possibly continental." "Continental?" repeated Edith, lowering her voice as if worried that Europe might overhear. Neither of these interpretations bore any resemblance to the small, blurred motif Purbright had glimpsed in the donor's letter, but accuracy had never been Rumour's chief ambition in Flaxborough. Ornamentation, embellishment, and a faint scent of scandal were universally preferred. Purbright, walking at his unhurried pace toward the police station, could detect these ripples without even trying. A nod here, a raised eyebrow there, the familiar sensation of being briefly but intensely regarded as he passed, all told him the town had already begun to supply motives, culprits, and moral lessons in equal measure. At the station, Sergeant Love greeted him with an earnestness that suggested he had been rehearsing questions in anticipation of news. "Something serious, sir?" Love asked. "Only I've heard 3 versions in the past 15 minutes. "I imagine each with increasing refinement," Purbright replied. "What have you heard?" Levibit did tick them off on his fingers. 1. Someone cut a rude shape out of the tapestry. 2. It was a coded message stitched inside. 3. A jealous craftsman removed it to sabotage the donor's reputation. Purbright removed his hat and set it on the desk. "The last one shows initiative, at least. No, the truth is still humble, a missing motif and no sign yet of why anyone should want it." Love frowned. Did the committee say who had access to the tapestry? "They said many things," Purbright murmured. "Few of them useful. Though Miss Fenn seems convinced something meaningful has been concealed, Mrs. Glossop believes the culprit artistically insecure, and Mr. Mousley's chief concern is that the press must not learn of it before the official unveiling. Will the press care, sir?" "Almost certainly not, but Mr. Mousley's anxieties run on rails of their own." Love nodded as though this were a profound truth. Purbright spent the next hour reviewing the donor's letter more carefully, particularly the small photograph of the tapestry before donation. The motif, a tiny circular crest of some sort, was blurry, indistinct, hardly the sort of thing that would provoke outrage even in the gentlest of sensibilities. Yet someone had gone to the trouble of cutting it out. And then there was the lavender. A faint trace, yes, but unmistakable. Purbright's experience with domestic scents was limited to what Mrs. Purbright occasionally purchased, but he recognized this lavender as the cheap, overly sweet sort frequently used by ladies of a certain thrift. He leaned back in his chair, interlacing his fingers. The committee, with their polite anxieties and carefully curated reputations, had provided a gallery of possible explanations without meaning to. Each had been quick to insist on their innocence, but quicker still to hint that someone else had acted strangely, or appeared flustered, or arrived late. And then there was the matter of the tapestry being hung before anyone asked for it. That alone suggested forethought. A small crime, perhaps, but rarely did small crimes emerge without some human tangle behind them. Purbright stood, collected his notes, and returned to the high street to continue a line of inquiry that had formed, not fully, but sufficiently, in his mind. His first stop was the bakery, where Mrs. Glossop often paused on Wednesday afternoons to criticize the prices of the pastries she nonetheless purchased. She was there now, as predictable as the scones cooling on the counter. At the inspector's approach, she assumed an expression of deep authority. "I was just telling Mrs. Chadley," she began without greeting, "that the motif looked suspiciously like a serpent, or perhaps a serpent entangled with a—" "Yes," Purbright interjected gently. "I'm sure speculation has been lively." "Lively?" echoed Mrs. Glossop, affronted. "It has been downright florid. People on the committee are saying all manner of things. One even suggested the donor's family wanted to suppress a scandal." "Did they say which family member?" "Oh, Inspector," she said, lowering her voice. "One hears things about the son, about the mother. That whole house was full of embroidered oddities." Purbright thanked her with patient courtesy and continued on. By late afternoon, he had gathered enough fragments of rumour to rival the tapestry itself in complexity, whispered warnings, hints of personal grudges, suspicions based on nothing firmer than who once moved a chair at a meeting. Some accused the caretaker, others the curator, and a few hinted at a mysterious outsider. None of it yet formed a coherent pattern, but Purbright had begun to sense the outline of one, faint but present, like the ghost of a design beneath worn fabric. And so, as dusk settled quietly over Flaxborough, he made his way back toward the museum. The tapestry hung undisturbed in the gallery, lacking its cut corner, yet somehow exuding a stronger presence than before. Purbright regarded it with the thoughtful stillness of a man listening for a whisper behind a closed door. Someone in town knew precisely why that motif had been removed, and, judging from the swirl of gossip now thickening like fog, several others suspected more than they wished to say aloud. Purbright exhaled lightly. The pattern, he suspected, was only just beginning to emerge. By the following morning, the museum felt subtly altered, as though the tapestry's quiet wound had unsettled the building's bones. Purbright arrived shortly after opening, greeted by the curator, Mr. Harford, whose thin smile suggested a man attempting to conceal a headache brought on by excessive civic responsibility. "I suppose you'll want to speak to everyone," Harford said, smoothing his lapels as though preparing for an inspection of military precision. "Not everyone," Purbright replied mildly. "Just those who might help clarify a few matters." This Harford interpreted, quite wrongly, as an invitation to supply a list of people he suspected. He launched into a brisk enumeration. "Well, the caretaker is clearly an eccentric fellow, fond of rearranging things, and Mrs. Glossop naturally has strong opinions about the tapestry's artistic merit. Miss Fenn is sensitive. And then there's Mr. Darch, the donor's son, who has been rather anxious since the tapestry arrived, not to mention the volunteers, who tend to see more than they acknowledge." Purbright listened with the patience of a man accustomed to the curator's brand of soft panic. When Harford paused for breath, the inspector simply nodded and asked to speak to the caretaker first. Mr. Malkin, the caretaker, was found polishing a display case with the reverence of a priest tending an altar. His round shoulders and apologetic posture suggested that he considered himself permanently on the verge of trouble, whether or not a trouble existed. "Morning, Mr. Malkin," Purbright said. "I'd like to ask about the tapestry." Malkin froze, cloth in hand. "I didn't touch it, sir. Truly, I wouldn't dare. I know people say I move things, but that's tidying, not interfering. Tidying's my job." Purbright studied him for a moment. The man's eyes darted nervously, not with guilt, but with fear of being misunderstood, a common affliction in Flaxborough's lower-paid ranks. "Did you see anyone near the storage room yesterday, before the tapestry was found hanging?" Malkin hesitated. "Can't say I saw exactly, but I heard someone. Footsteps. Light ones. Not Mr. Mousley's and not Miss Fenn's. She has a way of tapping her heels." This was softer. Could have been the curator, but he usually hums. Purbright nodded. "Did you smell anything? Lavender, perhaps?" This startled Malkin. "Lavender? Now you mention it. Maybe. Hard to tell. The volunteers bathe the place in scent sometimes." The inspector thanked him and moved on, leaving Malkin visibly relieved. Next was Miss Fenn, found in the small education room, preparing a set of leaflets for an upcoming school visit. She straightened the moment Purbright entered, as though anticipating accusation. "I only discovered the tapestry," she insisted before he spoke. "I wouldn't dream of cutting anything. I'm not even allowed to handle the loan exhibits." Purbright offered her a reassuring smile. "I simply wished to know what you observed. You found it already hung?" "Yes," she said, pushing her spectacles up her nose with a determined jab. "And I know the difference between official placements and whatever that was. It was hung too high, not dangerously so, but enough to show someone was in a hurry or not familiar with the proper method." "And the missing corner?" Miss Fenn pursed her lips. "A disgrace. Whoever did it lacks finesse. I've done embroidery for 40 years, Inspector. That cut was made quickly, carelessly." "Do you think anyone on the committee would take such liberty?" "Oh, no," she said, then hesitated. "Well, perhaps one or two might think themselves entitled, but not to damage, only to reposition." The implication hung in the air like a dust mote. Purbright did not press her further. He found Mrs. Glossop in the main hall, examining a glass case of porcelain figurines as though judging them in a competition they had not entered. Her expression brightened when she saw him. Mrs. Glossop enjoyed appearing helpful, particularly when it placed her at the centre of events. "I expect you've discovered something significant," she said, with confident expectancy. "Several things worth thinking about," Purbright replied. "Tell me, Mrs. Glossop, when you were in the gallery yesterday you mentioned smelling lavender." "Yes, indeed, quite unmistakable." "Who among the committee is known to use it?" She paused, sensing the political delicacy of the question. "Well, Miss Fenn wears it occasionally, but the good sort. Mrs. Chadley favours rosewater. Mrs. Rundle wears nothing out of principle. But there is, of course, Mrs. Gillyforth." "Ah?" "She uses lavender," said Mrs. Glossop, with the tone of someone revealing a small but meaningful secret. "The cheap kind, I suspect. But you didn't hear that from me." Purbright thanked her and made a note. He wondered whether Mrs. Gillyforth realized how her perfume travelled. His next encounter was with Mr. Darch, the donor's son, who arrived at the museum breathless and slightly dishevelled, as though pursued by the very notion of inconvenience. He greeted Purbright with an uneasy handshake. "I'm terribly sorry about all this," Darch murmured. "Mother would be mortified. Her tapestry damaged." "You were close to her?" Purbright asked. Darch shrugged. "As close as one can be to a woman who spent most of her time sewing or criticizing other people's sewing." "And the motif that's missing from the corner, do you know its significance?" At this, Darch stiffened. "None. It was just decoration. She had all sorts of strange symbols stitched into her work. Meant nothing." Purbright watched him closely. "You seem quite certain." Yes, completely." Darch's eyes shifted to the tapestry, anxious and lingering. "I would prefer the whole matter kept discreet. My mother valued propriety." Propriety often cloaked more than it displayed. Purbright noted the man's tension, not grief, but apprehension, and the faint scent of lavender that lingered, not cheap lavender, but something subtler, made him reconsider the earlier assumption. By midday, Purbright had spoken with 6 volunteers, each offering their own mild contradictions. One claimed to have seen a shadow near the gallery door. Another insisted that nothing unusual occurred except a curious draught. A third confessed to seeing someone leaving early but refused to name them for fear of causing upset. The tapestry, meanwhile, seemed to observe all this with silent amusement, its missing corner now a small but insistent mystery. As Purbright walked slowly through the gallery once more, the pattern of human behaviour was beginning to take shape, not yet clear but forming threads of fear, vanity, secrecy, and the ever-present desire in Flaxborough to avoid embarrassment at any cost. Someone had removed that motif with purpose. Someone who feared what it revealed, and someone, Purbright suspected, who believed they had done so unnoticed. But in Flaxborough, nothing remained unnoticed for long. The motif, wrapped carefully in Purbright's handkerchief, felt strangely weighty as he carried it back toward the museum. Not physically, of course. It was no larger than a plumstone, but in implication. Someone had taken it with expert precision, spirited it away, and then, for reasons not yet clear, allowed it to reappear in a book about pruning roses. It was a clue, certainly, but one whose meaning remained obscured beneath Flaxborough's customary layers of genteel self-deception. By the time Purbright reached the museum steps, he sensed a shift in the air, the peculiar atmosphere that settles when a group of people has already decided on the culprit before facts have had any opportunity to interfere. Inside, the committee had assembled, not by arrangement but by gravitation, like startled birds flocking to the same branch. Mrs. Glossop stood at the epicenter of a small cluster, her voice lowered but carrying effortlessly. And really, when one considers Mr. Malkin's habits, it becomes quite clear. The man rearranges things when no one is looking. He holds a mop as though it were a conductor's baton. He is, unpredictable. Purbright stepped into the gallery before her statement could escalate from insinuation to full theatrical accusation. The committee startled slightly, guilt of the collective variety, as though caught gossiping in church. "Inspector," Mrs. Glossop said, smoothing her blouse, "we were merely discussing developments." "I imagined so," Purbright said gently. "Developments do tend to invite discussion." Mr. Harford, the curator, cleared his throat with officious gravity. "I believe, Inspector, that you should speak with Malkin again. Several of us feel his behavior lately has been eccentric." "Eccentric," echoed Mrs. Chadley, helpfully. "And erratic," added Mrs. Rundle, who appeared uncertain of the difference, but determined to contribute. Purbright folded his hands calmly. "I have just returned from the library. The missing motif has reappeared in a book returned last night." This produced a brief, satisfying silence. Even Mrs. Glossop needed a moment to digest the significance. "In a book?" repeated Harford, blinking. "But what possible—" "Perhaps he hid it there," Mrs. Glossop supplied, regaining momentum. Caretakers are known for their odd sentimentalities. "He may have felt guilty. Or frightened," said Mrs. Rundle. "He might be simple." Mr. Harford raised a hand. "Let us be fair. Malkin is diligent, if unconventional." "Still, Inspector, surely you must agree he is a likely suspect?" Purbright regarded them mildly, though he noted the eagerness in their voices. Too eager, like school children, hoping to close a difficult exercise quickly. The desire for a tidy explanation often grew in direct proportion to a committee's discomfort. "I find," he said, "that likelihood depends greatly on perspective." This cryptic remark did little to deter them. Mrs. Glossop leaned closer. "But he was nearby. He's here early always. He tidies unsupervised, and he has keys to the storage rooms." "As do several others," Purbright said. A ripple of awkwardness passed through the group. Such practical truths were rarely appreciated. Miss Fenn, who had been standing on the outskirts of the conversation, cleared her throat delicately. "Mr. Malkin is a gentle soul. I cannot imagine him cutting anything, let alone a piece of art." Mrs. Glossop raised a brow. "You cannot imagine because you are soft-hearted, Honoria." "Or because," said Purbright quietly, "there is no clear reason why he would." The weight of this landed unevenly. Some looked chastened, others looked merely thwarted. Harford sighed, exasperation softening his tone. "Inspector, surely you must acknowledge it is rather a coincidence, the man's proximity, his access, his quirks." "Coincidences," Purbright murmured, "often grow when watered by impatience." He drew the handkerchief from his pocket and unfolded it. The embroidered motif, delicate and precise, caught the gallery's faint light. Threads of gold shimmered faintly. A collective gasp rose, though more, Purbright suspected, from excitement than aesthetic appreciation. "Is that it?" Mrs. Rundle breathed. "The very piece removed from your tapestry?" Purbright said. "But note how clean the cut is. This was not torn out impulsively." Mrs. Glossop sniffed. Well, Mr. Malkin could hardly manage a delicate cut. "That," Purbright replied with a small smile, "is precisely the point." The door behind them creaked, and Mr. Malkin entered, arms full of brushes. He stopped mid-step upon seeing the assembled committee, the look on his face suggesting the sudden recollection of an unpaid bill. "Oh," he said softly, "I didn't know there was a meeting." Mrs. Glossop adopted a solemn tone, one she reserved for scolding inferior minds. "Mr. Malkin, we must ask—" "Mrs. Glossop," Purbright interrupted courteously, "I will speak with Mr. Malkin privately." Her lips pursed, thwarted again, but she nodded. Purbright led the caretaker into the corridor. Malkin wrung his hands nervously. "I swear, Inspector, I didn't move that tapestry. I didn't cut anything. Folks think I'm odd, but I'm careful. I look after the place proper." "I believe you," Purbright said. Malkin blinked. "You do?" "Yes, but others will continue to suspect you unless we clarify a few things." Relief flickered across the man's face. "Ask whatever you like." Purbright questioned him gently about the after-hours routines, the storage rooms, and the night the tapestry had been placed in the gallery. Malkin answered earnestly. He locked up as usual. Nothing sounded amiss. He heard no footsteps that night. "And lavender?" Purbright asked. "Do you use it?" Malkin looked puzzled. "I use polish. Smells like vinegar. Never lavender." That too, Purbright believed. Malkin had no reason to lie about perfume. He returned to the gallery, leaving the caretaker immeasurably lighter. The committee fell silent as Purbright re-entered, each face eager for his verdict. "I find no basis," he said calmly, "to consider Mr. Malkin responsible." Mrs. Glossop sputtered. "But surely—" "Surely," Purbright repeated, "we should consider other possibilities. The tapestry was cut with finesse, the motif reappeared with intention, and the scent of lavender at the scene does not originate from Mr. Malkin." For a moment the committee looked collectively adrift. Then, almost predictably, Mrs. Glossop recovered her footing. "Well then, if not him, who?" Purbright glanced at the tapestry, at the careful cut, at the faint shimmer of the recovered motif in his hand. "That," he said, "is what we must now determine." And as he spoke, he noticed, just for a moment, the slightest twitch of alarm on one face within the committee. Small, fleeting, but unmistakably human. By late morning the next day, Flaxborough had reached that pleasant stage of civic agitation in which the public no longer cared what had happened, only who might be persuaded to confess to something. The tapestry, the missing motif, the lavender, all had settled into the town's collective imagination like props awaiting actors. Purbright, however, remained quietly focused on the subtle tensions he had seen tightening around several committee members. He was on his way back to the museum when he was intercepted by a breathless figure in a cardigan the colour of weak tea. Mrs. Hartle, assistant librarian and professional worrier, waved to him from across the street with the urgency of one summoning a midwife. "Inspector! Oh, Inspector, thank goodness you're passing." Purbright crossed the road with polite deliberation. "Good morning, Mrs. Hartle. Nothing amiss at the library, I trust?" "Oh, but there is!" she exclaimed, placing both hands atop the large stack of returned books she carried, as though preventing them from escaping. "Something quite dreadful has been found, quite inexplicable." Purbright refrained from suggesting that inexplicable discoveries were rather common in libraries, especially on Thursdays when returns were heavy. Instead, he followed her inside. The Flaxborough Public Library was its usual self, quiet, faintly dusty, and presided over by an assortment of elderly readers who regarded conversation as a personal affront. Mrs. Hartle led Purbright toward the returns desk, where a gardening book lay open, its pages spread like a crime scene. "There," she whispered, pointing at the centerfold. Purbright leaned in. Nestled between a chapter on pruning and a black-and-white photograph of topiary stood a small embroidered circle, a scrap of tapestry cloth expertly cut, the edges neat and precise. The missing motif. For a moment, Purbright said nothing. The air felt unusually still, as though every shelf was listening. "When was this found?" he asked at last. "Only half an hour ago, Inspector," Mrs. Hartle replied. "Young Tommy Pledge brought it to the desk. He opened the book, and there it was, tucked in like a bookmark." He turned quite pale. Tommy Pledge, a boy of 8, who now hovered nearby with the wide eyes of one accidentally entangled in a mystery, swallowed hard and added, "I didn't put it there, sir. I only looked because Mum likes those gardening pictures." Purbright nodded gently. "I'm sure you didn't." The scrap, unlike the supposedly crude cut described at the museum, bore the unmistakable delicacy of careful scissors. Whoever removed it had skill and purpose. The motif itself, though small, was clearer than the photograph from the donor's letter. A circular crest featuring a bird perched above an ornate letter, stitched in a goldish thread. Mrs. Hartle whispered, "Do you think it's valuable?" "In monetary terms," Purbright replied, "perhaps not, but in other terms, potentially." He closed the book slowly, noting its borrowing slip. "Who returned this?" Mrs. Hartle glanced nervously at the list. "It was dropped in the after-hours box yesterday evening. We haven't yet sorted that pile. Could have been anyone." "But you've a list of borrowers." "Oh, yes, yes." She hurried behind the desk, adjusted her glasses and consulted the index card. "It was last borrowed by Mrs. Gillyforth 2 months ago." Purbright allowed himself a moment's quiet reflection. Lavender. Cheap lavender. And now a scrap appearing in a book she had once borrowed. Not proof, not yet, but it shifted the threads of the tapestry in a new direction. "Mrs. Gillyforth was in earlier," Mrs. Hartle added, as if remembering something significant, returned a novel and asked when our spring lecture series begins. "Nothing unusual." "Nothing unusual," Purbright repeated softly, "except that a piece of a tapestry has travelled into one of your books." He wrapped the motif in a clean handkerchief, then turned back to Tommy. "Did anyone else touch this book before you?" Tommy shook his head vigorously. "No, sir. It was on the trolley. I just grabbed it." Mrs. Hartle nodded. "The trolley was wheeled out this morning. No one but staff handles those before sorting." Purbright considered this. "And among the staff?" "Just me, Mr. Evershaw, and Miss Lockett." "Mr. Evershaw never notices anything, bless him." "Miss Lockett is very careful. She would never... well, you know." Yes, Purbright did know librarians cared for their books with the kind of possessiveness one usually saw in antique dealers or older siblings. None of them would casually tuck stray fabric into a volume. "May I take the book as well?" he asked. "Oh, of course, but please bring it back. Someone was asking about propagation guides only yesterday." Purbright promised to return it and stepped outside, where the daylight felt sharper, as though the discovery had subtly altered the town's perspective. The motif had resurfaced, not discarded, not hidden away in a drawer, or burned to ash, but placed, deliberately, in a book about gardens, a book last borrowed by a woman who wore lavender, whose presence in the museum had been unremarked, yet hinted at in sideways glances. He walked toward the museum again, pacing slowly, allowing the thought to settle. This was no act of clumsy mischief. Someone was guiding the discovery, leaving hints, but only for those willing to see them. On the way, he passed the stationery shop where Mrs. Glossop now held a small audience, waving her hands dramatically. "It was a message," she declared. "Clearly that little emblem had a meaning, something improper. They say the donor's mother stitched secrets into her work." Purbright paused nearby, unseen. Gossip had surged yet again, fast and eager. But today it served him. Rumour loosened tongues, tongues revealed fears, and fears pointed toward motives. He returned to the museum with the book tucked under his arm. The tapestry hung where it had before, dignified and wounded. For a moment he imagined it whole again, crest, bird, and all, and considered what might embarrass a family enough to snip history out of its own embroidery. Someone had taken that motif with care, someone had left it to be found, and someone, he suspected, was beginning to feel the pressure of their own threads tightening. For the rest of that afternoon the museum seemed to hum with a strange, self-conscious quiet, the kind that settles when people suspect that eyes, perhaps not entirely human ones, are watching. The tapestry hung solemnly, missing corner exposed, and the recovered motif rested in Purbright's pocket like a secret waiting to be weighed. Yet what most interested him were not objects, but the shifting expressions on the faces of the committee members as they dispersed. He lingered in the vestibule briefly, watching them leave. Mrs. Glossop stormed out first, affronted that her theory had been dismissed. Miss Fenn followed, anxious and fluttering like a moth, unsure of the nearest lamp. Mrs. Rundle hurried away with the air of someone protecting a secret thought. Harford, the curator, retreated to his office, shoulders drooping under the strain of attempted leadership. And then there was Mrs. Gillyforth. She lingered longer than the others, pretending to study a notice board she had surely memorized months ago. When at last she left, she moved quickly, lavender trailing faintly behind her, the cheap kind. Purbright watched her go, eyes calm, mind quietly collecting these threads. He stepped back into the gallery. The room felt colder now, perhaps because it had been emptied of bodies, but filled with unspoken tension. He glanced at the tapestry once more, then left the museum to walk the short distance to Mr. Darch's home, a modest semi with a garden that attempted roses but achieved only thorns. Mr. Darch answered on the fourth knock. He looked startled, though not entirely displeased to see the inspector. "Oh, Inspector Purbright, do come in." The living room spoke of an inheritance split between sentiment and haste. Framed landscapes hung beside empty hooks, boxes were stacked haphazardly near the fireplace, and a china cabinet stood half-filled, half-forgotten. Darch gestured for Purbright to sit. "You mentioned your mother stitched several unusual symbols into her tapestries," Purbright began. Darch swallowed. "Yes, she had her little whims, birds, initials, odd patterns. She said they were family flourishes, but I think she just liked to keep her hands busy." "And the missing motif, the crest, that would be one of them?" "I suppose so," Darch murmured, though unease pinched the corners of his expression. "Nothing important, nothing anyone need fuss about." Purbright let the silence stretch. When people feared silence, it tended to say more than it held. At last, Darch exhaled sharply. "If you must know, Mother was particular. She didn't want certain old matters brought up, but it's nothing, certainly nothing worth cutting." Purbright nodded, though he doubted Darch was being wholly candid. The man was anxious not in the way of guilt, but in the way of someone whose family affairs were more complicated than polite society allowed. As he left, Purbright filed away those evasions alongside lavender and the precision of the cut. He made his way next to the town hall, where Councillor Gilmby was engaged in what he called chairmanship, a process that mostly involved admonishing clerks and perfecting the placement of his fountain pen. Gilmby looked up as Purbright entered, eyebrows raised in surprised delight. "Inspector, what a pleasure. Is this about museum security? I've been saying for years the place needs better locks." Purbright allowed himself a slight smile. "Not precisely, Councillor. I'm gathering information." "Oh, about the Tapestry incident?" Gilmby leaned back, eager. "Well, you needn't look far. Harford's been losing his grip for years, and those women on the committee, territorial, doesn't begin to cover it. The feuds over funding alone would frighten a bishop." "Feuds," Purbright repeated mildly. Gilmby nodded with relish. Mrs. Glossop once threatened to resign if Mrs. Rundle's proposal for a textile conservation grant passed. Said it encouraged wasteful nostalgia. Then there was that business last year. Something about the newsletter's editorial tone. And don't ask about Miss Fenn and Mrs. Gillyforth. Whatever quarrel they have is buried deep, but occasionally one sees the earth shift. Over committee matters? Over pride, Inspector. Committee matters merely give pride something to polish. This accorded neatly with what Purbright already suspected, that the Tapestry incident had not sprung from impulse, but from older, buried things. Flaxborough's most enduring disputes often wore polite smiles until pressed. When Purbright thanked Gilmby and left, dusk had begun to seep across the rooftops, turning the edges of the town soft and familiar. The kind of evening in which secrets felt especially restless. He decided to walk past the home of Mrs. Gillyforth, not to call on her, not yet, but simply to observe. Her house, a narrow terrace with flower pots along the front step, was lit from within by a warm glow. A shadow passed across the curtains, a figure pacing, pausing, pacing again, someone troubled. As he continued on, he nearly collided with two volunteers from the museum, Mrs. Chadley and Miss Lockett, engaged in a whispered argument. "I'm telling you," Mrs. Chadley insisted, "Honoria saw someone in the gallery early that morning, and she's too kind to say who." Miss Lockett bit her lip. "Well, I heard Mrs. Gillyforth complaining about the donor's family at the last meeting. Said something about old mistakes coming back." Their voices fell to a hiss as they noticed Purbright, who offered a polite nod but did not stop. They scurried off in opposite directions, demonstrating the town's instinctive response to being overheard, denial through separation. He returned slowly toward the police station, thoughts weaving together. Here was what he now understood. Rivalries in the committee were old, layered, and politely venomous. Darch feared family embarrassment. Gillyforth wore lavender and lingered too long. Miss Fenn withheld a name. Glossop searched for a convenient culprit, and the motif, reappearing with careful placement, seemed intended not to hide truth, but to guide it. The tapestry was no longer simply a damaged artifact. It was a stage on which personal grievances, family secrets, and quiet apprehensions were playing their parts, each movement deliberate, each silence too carefully shaped. As Purbright walked into the gathering twilight, he felt certain of one thing. The threads were tightening, and someone among them had begun to realize that Purbright was not merely observing, he was listening. The following morning arrived with a thin, watery sunlight that did little to lift the mood of Flaxborough. Purbright had barely reached the station when Sergeant Love hurried toward him with an expression normally reserved for escaped livestock or mishaps involving council members and wet cement. "Sir, the museum rang. Something's happened." Purbright set down his hat. "Another missing corner?" "No, sir, not missing. Moved." Love's tone suggested the rearrangement of objects was far more sinister than theft. In Flaxborough, that was occasionally true. They walked briskly to the museum, where the curator, Mr. Harford, hovered near the main entrance with the air of a man awaiting judgment for a failure entirely beyond his control. His spectacles were slightly askew, a sure sign of distress, Inspector, thank goodness. It's a disaster. Not a destructive one, but, well, decidedly odd. He led them inside. Purbright paused in the doorway of the first gallery, taking in the scene with a slow, thoughtful sweep of the eyes. Nothing was broken, nothing missing, but everything, absolutely everything, was wrong. Displays had been rearranged into a strange and unsettling logic of their own. A Victorian mourning brooch sat atop a model of a steam engine. A child's wooden hobby horse leaned against a case of agricultural tools. Ceramic teapots had been placed beside fossil fragments. Worst of all, an Elizabethan glove, normally displayed upright with dignified care, lay draped over a stuffed kestrel in a pose that seemed almost mocking. Harford wrung his hands. It happened sometime during the night. I found the back door unlatched this morning. Nothing seems stolen but the symbolism. Symbolism? Love echoed, alarmed. Well, surely this arrangement means something. Harford gestured helplessly. Someone has made a statement. Purbright stepped carefully through the gallery, studying not only the objects but the absence of chaos. This was not vandalism in the usual sense. The items were placed deliberately, not scattered. There was no sign of haste. Whoever had done this had taken time, perhaps a great deal of it. He paused before the hobby horse resting against the sharp metal of a 19th century harvesting hook. Mrs. Gillyforth was a children's tutor once, Harford offered quietly, as though volunteering a name without quite doing so. Was she? Purbright murmured, running a finger along the grain of the wooden toy. And who among the committee has access to the alarm codes? Harford hesitated. Well, technically all of them, but most wouldn't know how to use them. We've had to reset the system 3 times this month. That was less useful than Harford seemed to think, but Purbright nodded anyway. Miss Fenn entered the gallery then, eyes wide with dismay. "Oh, my poor displays," she whispered. "They look like they've been through an emotional crisis." She approached the kestrel, hands trembling. "Why would anyone put a glove on its head? It's absurd. It's unnatural. It's—" "Intentional," Purbright said, his voice gentle. Miss Fenn shuddered. "Do you think this is connected to the tapestry?" "I expect it is," Purbright replied, though he knew better than to elaborate. Mrs. Glossop swept in moments later, breathless with purpose, followed by Mrs. Chadley and Mrs. Rundle. They gasped in unison. "This is an outrage," Mrs. Glossop declared. "A personal attack on the committee, clearly." "Or on the curator," Mrs. Chadley suggested. "Or on the museum itself," Mrs. Rundle said, as though diagnosing an illness. Purbright suspected it was none of these things, or perhaps all of them at once. The arrangement felt communicative. The juxtaposition of childhood, agriculture, death, and time hinted at a message, though its meaning remained just out of reach. Sergeant Love, staring at the steam engine beneath the mourning brooch, whispered, "It's almost like someone making a pattern." "A rearrangement," Purbright said. "Not random, not careless." Mrs. Glossop seized on this. "Then it absolutely must be the caretaker. I told you he has strange, artistic impulses." "Malkin was thoroughly questioned yesterday," Purbright replied. "And this work required a level of confidence he does not possess." Miss Fenn nodded vigorously. "He wouldn't dare touch any display without asking me. And this—" She gestured broadly. "This is not tidying. This is commentary." Commentary indeed. The rearrangement drew the committee deeper into the gallery, each woman interpreting the display through her own preferences and grudges. Mrs. Chadley muttered that Mrs. Gillyforth had an overly symbolic mind. Mrs. Rundle suggested Glossop's temper alone could have prompted such disorder, if misdirected. Mrs. Glossop retorted that Rundle's lack of taste made her blind to artistic meaning. The accusations, though cloaked in civility, revealed the committee's fractures more clearly than any direct questioning could have. Purbright walked away from the chatter to the tapestry in the adjacent gallery. It hung in its place, unchanged, except that the absence of its motif now seemed more pronounced, more deliberate. The missing piece felt somehow connected to this nocturnal rearrangement. Not through theft, but through intent. He thought again of the motif in the gardening book. Gardening, growth, pruning, reordering. Someone was pruning the museum itself, reshaping it, cutting and reattaching meaning. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to find Mr. Darch standing uneasily in the doorway, his expression unsettled. "They called me," Darch said quietly. "Said something had happened. I don't understand. Why would anyone do this?" "Because," Purbright replied softly, "they wish to communicate something, and the museum is their language." Darch's face tightened. "Do you think this is still about the tapestry?" "Almost certainly." The man swallowed. "If my mother, if her symbol, if that crest—" Purbright raised a calming hand. "I don't yet believe this concerns your mother's reputation, but it might concern someone else's." Behind them, the committee erupted into another round of speculative bickering. Harford fretted about insurance, Miss Fenn wrung her hands, and Sergeant Love dutifully recorded each misplaced object, as though cataloguing clues in a puzzle built by an eccentric child. Purbright studied the gallery one final time. No destruction, no malice, just careful, deliberate disarray. Someone wanted attention drawn away from the single act of cutting the motif, and towards something larger, something layered, something not yet revealed. He turned toward the exit, thoughts knitting themselves into a pattern. The first disruption had been precise, the second theatrical. There would be a third. Patterns, after all, seldom stopped halfway. By the time Purbright stepped away from the disordered galleries and into the cool afternoon air, Flaxborough seemed to have resumed its usual appearance, calm, respectable, faintly self-important. A passer-by might have believed the town incapable of producing so much as a crooked notice board, let alone 2 calculated intrusions into its museum. But Purbright knew better. Respectability was often the first refuge of mischief. He walked slowly, letting the rhythm of his steps settle the churn of thoughts. When puzzles became tangled, movement often loosened their threads. He crossed the high street with its wide windows and modest bustle, and made his way toward the river path where fewer eyes watched, and the quiet felt less performative. The river moved at its usual unhurried pace, brownish, steady, faintly grumbling over weeds. Purbright paused beside the railing. The museum's rearranged displays hovered at the edge of his thoughts like an unfinished sentence. The hobby horse propped against agricultural steel, the mourning brooch laid over a model engine, the glove over the kestrel. It was too pointed to be random, too cohesive to be clumsy. He removed the handkerchief from his pocket and unfolded it just enough to glimpse the stolen motif. Its bird perched proudly atop the single ornate letter. R, the gold thread, still glimmered faintly. Someone had wanted this hidden, and someone had wanted it found. 2 impulses, opposite in intention, curiously woven. He tucked it away again. The crisp edge of the cut, so precise, so confident, lingered in his mind. This was not the work of a frightened amateur or an impulsive vandal. Whoever had cut it knew exactly what they were doing, how to remove a delicate piece without fraying the surrounding embroidery. He thought of Miss Fenn's remark that the cut at the museum had looked crude, yet the piece he'd retrieved from the library was immaculate. So the crudity had been staged, a disguise of incompetence to deflect suspicion. From whom? He considered each member of the committee in turn. Mrs. Glossop, loud theories, louder indignation, fond of attention, but incapable of subtle handiwork. Mrs. Rundle, fastidious, quick to judge, but her carefulness showed in her stitching, too tight, too rigid. Miss Fenn, skilled, yes, but timid. Her conscience would have erupted long before scissors touched cloth. Mrs. Gillyforth, lavender, evasiveness, the strange tension in her posture. Once a tutor, good with her hands, according to rumours of handcrafted toys she used to make for her pupils. Harford, orderly, fretful, but no flair for symbolism. Darch, evasive about his mother's family flourishes, troubled by something unspoken. And then the rearranged displays, objects placed with the intention of metaphor, childhood and labour, grief, and industry, fragility and predation. Not destruction, but a message of some kind. He leaned against the railing, letting the river's calm nudge the threads of thought closer. People rearranged objects for many reasons: children to play, curators to educate, eccentrics to amuse themselves. But adults rearranged symbolically when they felt unable to rearrange people. Someone was expressing something they could not say aloud, a rivalry, a grievance, a warning, or an attempt to divert attention from the cut tapestry. He replayed each conversation from the past days, the faint tremor in Mrs. Gillyforth's voice, the way Darch hesitated around any mention of his mother's motifs, the repeated insistence by multiple committee members that Malkin was eccentric. Such unanimity often concealed the desire to bury a more uncomfortable truth. Lavender. Cheap, unmistakable lavender. It trailed from the tapestry frame, faintly from the storage room door, and quite noticeably from Mrs. Gillyforth's coat whenever she grew nervous. Purbright had not forgotten the way she lingered in the museum after others had fled, and yet she did not strike him as someone confident enough to orchestrate such theatrical rearrangement. Or was that precisely why she did it? The mild become bold when cornered. But then there was Darch. His evasions held a different quality, not guilt of action, but guilt of omission. He had avoided looking at the recovered motif for more than a few seconds, as though it reminded him of something he preferred buried. And the crest, the R, could have belonged to a family name. Yet the rearrangements seemed unrelated to him. They bore the mark not of repression, but of commentary. Purbright inhaled the river's cool scent, grounding himself. The town's gossip had been unusually helpful this time, not because it was accurate, but because it illuminated the tensions people wished to hide. So many small rivalries lay just beneath Flaxborough's polished surfaces. Any one of them could have fueled the desire to cause embarrassment, to unsettle a committee, to disrupt the illusions of order they clung to. But two incidents, one precise, one symbolic, suggested not two culprits, but one with layered intentions. He turned from the river and continued his walk, passing the bakery where Mrs. Glossop was already animatedly recounting her interpretation of the morning's events. Her voice floated out through the open door. "It's the caretaker, of course. Who else has time to meddle in the dead of night? Mark my words." Purbright smiled faintly. Mrs. Glossop's certainty made her a valuable barometer of the town's collective laziness. People preferred explanations that simplified life, even when wrong. He passed the post office next. Inside, Mr. Scroton watched him through the window with the calm expectation of a man awaiting news he planned to distribute discreetly but thoroughly by tea time. At last, Purbright reached the quieter streets near his own home. The stillness here felt honest, fewer ears pressed against doorways, fewer curtains twitched. he slowed his steps further. The rearranged exhibits troubled him not for their audacity but for their gentleness. No malice, no mockery, just a firm nudge toward meaning. Someone wanted to be heard. Someone wanted the committee to remember something or admit something. A truth concealed in the past, perhaps, now pushing upward like a long-buried root. He reached his gate, but did not enter. Instead, he stood, watching a pigeon hop along the cobbles, pecking at nothing in particular with solemn concentration. People pecked at nothing too, he thought. At distractions, at conveniences, at scapegoats. But the real clue rarely sat where people pointed. He touched the folded handkerchief in his pocket. One bird embroidered, one letter, one hidden message, one person who had wanted it removed, and one who had wanted it found. The pattern was not yet complete, but its outline was sharpening. And Purbright knew, with the calm certainty he seldom voiced aloud, that the next step would draw the culprit closer. Not by confrontation, but through their own impatience. He stepped inside at last, the faintest smile touching his lips. Human nature, after all, always revealed itself in the quiet moments. Purbright returned to the museum early the next morning, with the sort of unhurried certainty that made people nervous without quite knowing why. He had spent much of the previous evening arranging his thoughts into the beginnings of a purposeful thread, not an accusation, those were premature, but an opportunity. People, when given room to talk, often revealed more than questions ever could. And when allowed to talk in front of their rivals, they tended to reveal far too much. It was this principle that guided him as he approached the curator's office. Mr. Harford was already inside, polishing his spectacles with the anxious precision of a man hoping to buffer away responsibility. "Mr. Harford," Purbright said pleasantly, "I wonder if you might assist me in arranging a brief meeting this morning. Nothing formal, just a small gathering to clarify a few details." Harford brightened at the word clarify, as if it suggested the burden might soon lift from his own shoulders. "Of course, Inspector. The committee, you mean?" "A few members," Purbright replied. "Mrs. Gillyforth, Mrs. Glossop, Miss Fenn, and Mr. Darch, if he is willing." Harford paused, sensing the potential volatility of that combination, but nodded dutifully. "I can telephone them at once." "Don't press the matter," Purbright added mildly. "Simply say the inspector wishes to coordinate our understanding of recent events." This phrasing, unobtrusive, yet mysteriously important, worked every time. Within an hour they had gathered in the main gallery, each trying to appear unruffled by the presence of the others. Mrs. Glossop arrived first, righteous as a church bell. Miss Fenn followed timidly, clutching her handbag like a moral talisman. Mrs. Gillyforth stepped in last, lavender preceding her by a distinct margin. Darch arrived moments later, more disoriented than defensive. Purbright stood near the tapestry, hands loosely behind his back. The missing corner gave the piece an oddly exposed expression, as though its secret had been roughly plucked from it. "Thank you all for coming," he began gently. "I appreciate your time. I wished only to review certain aspects of our investigation and perhaps ease a few anxieties." Mrs. Glossop sniffed loudly. "My anxieties are about the security of this museum, Inspector, and the reliability of its caretaker." Mrs. Gillyforth shifted. Miss Fenn winced. Darch cleared his throat. Purbright smiled with polite neutrality. "Anxieties often tell us more than objects do, Mrs. Glossop. In fact, concerns about who might have acted often reveal much about who has been paying attention." This produced a gratifying and telling silence. He turned slightly, addressing the group as whole. "As you know, the missing motif has been recovered. It was not merely torn away, it was excised with skill. The person responsible understood embroidery." Mrs. Glossop straightened, mouth opening, but Purbright continued before she could launch another misguided theory. "Additionally," he said, "we know the cut displayed at the museum was deliberately made to appear crude, masking the true precision. Quite a careful deception." He let his gaze drift, not sharply, toward Mrs. Gillyforth. She stiffened, scarcely perceptible, but enough for Purbright to observe. Miss Fenn noticed too. Her eyes darted toward her colleague with a flicker of uncertainty. Glossop, oblivious to subtlety, took the moment to press forward. "Well, this proves a point I've been making. Whoever did this tried to hide their ability, which, I might add, eliminates certain people. Or implicates them," Purbright offered softly. "Depending on perspective." Mrs. Glossop faltered. "Well, yes, but I know what you meant," Purbright said with a courteous dip of the head. "But let us not hurry." He stepped just slightly closer, drawing the group's attention without raising his voice. "There is also the matter of the rearrangement of displays, a peculiar act, symbolic, perhaps, more expressive than destructive." Darch exhaled sharply. Mrs. Gillyforth pressed her fingers together. Miss Fenn's pupils widened. Purbright continued in a thoughtful tone, as though merely musing aloud. "Such an arrangement would require time, quiet access, familiarity with the rooms." "And imagination," added Miss Fenn timidly. "Indeed," Purbright said, "which narrows our field remarkably." Mrs. Glossop looked puzzled, but before she could ask, Purbright lifted a hand, directing attention to the tapestry. "This bird," he said softly, indicating the space where the motif had been removed, "and the letter beneath it, an initial, a family initial perhaps." Darch flinched. Purbright did not look at him directly, but allowed the silence to widen just enough for self-consciousness to flood the room. Darch spoke, voice trembling on the edge of dignity. "Inspector, if you're suggesting my mother—" "I'm suggesting nothing," Purbright interrupted gently. "Only observing that symbols often outlive the intentions of those who create them." A faint tremor passed across Mrs. Gillyforth's expression, fear mixed with something like resignation. Purbright pressed on softly. "A motif, hidden, then revealed. A rearrangement designed not to mask, but to speak. And lavender, noticed where it had no reason to be." He let this last detail settle like dust in sunlight. Mrs. Gillyforth swallowed. Her hands tightened around the strap of her handbag. Mrs. Glossop, at last, catching the breeze of implication, demanded, "Inspector, if you have a suspect, you must say so." Purbright shook his head lightly. "No, Mrs. Glossop, not a suspect. A question." He directed the question not pointedly, but with gentle ambiguity toward the entire group. "Who among you felt something in that tapestry should not be seen? And who feared, once it was removed, that silence might not be enough to keep the past from rearranging itself?" No one moved. Even the air in the gallery seemed to pause. A long, still moment held them all, Gillyforth pale, Darch uneasy, Miss Fenn inwardly torn, and Glossop indignant but lost. Purbright did not press further. The best nudges were quiet, subtle, and left to echo in the mind long after the conversation ended. He stepped back, his voice returning to its calm, almost casual warmth. "Thank you. That is all I needed for today. I appreciate your cooperation." Relief, confusion, suspicion, and unspoken dread rippled unevenly through the group. They dispersed slowly, each carrying the weight of what had not been said. Purbright watched them go, his expression unreadable. A nudge had been given, and someone, sooner rather than later, would stumble under the pressure of keeping their balance. The tea room at the back of the museum, small, sunlit, and quietly reminiscent of a church annex, had been chosen by Purbright with deliberate care. It was neutral ground, Too modest for theatrics, too genteel for raised voices, a setting in which truth, when finally spoken aloud, would sound almost polite. Mrs. Gillyforth sat near the window, hands clasped around a cup she hadn't touched. Her lavender perfume, faint but persistent, mingled with the sharper scent of oversteeped Earl Grey. Across from her, Darch shifted uneasily in his seat, blinking at the tablecloth as though its floral design carried some secret he ought to decipher. Harford hovered nearby, fidgeting with sugar packets. Miss Fenn perched primly on the edge of her chair, anxious for everyone. Mrs. Glossop sat upright as a weather vane in a stiff breeze, prepared to pass judgment on any revelation with the assurance of one already convinced she knew it. Purbright poured himself a modest cup of tea, settled lightly into his chair, and spoke with the calm certainty of someone guiding a thread through a needle. "Thank you all for agreeing to meet again. I hope to ease a few concerns lingering from our previous discussion." The phrase "ease concerns" carried just enough ambiguity to hold their attention. Miss Fenn relaxed visibly. Darch exhaled. Mrs. Gillyforth did not move. Purbright continued, his tone unforced. The events of the past days, both the removal of the Tapestry's motif and the nocturnal rearrangement of the galleries, suggest acts not of destruction, but of expression. Someone wished to hide something, yet also wished to be heard. Harford glanced at the window, as though expecting the culprit to flit past like a guilty sparrow. Mrs. Glossop folded her arms meaningfully. Purbright set down his cup. The motif recovered at the library, the carefully cut crest, depicts a bird perched upon an embroidered initial. A family initial, I think. Darch swallowed. "It doesn't matter," he murmured. "It was only part of Mother's decorative whims." "Perhaps," Purbright allowed. "But if so, why remove it? And why plant it in a book about gardens? And why rearrange displays in a way that speaks of childhood, memory, grief, labour, and reminders?" His gaze drifted toward Mrs. Gillyforth, not accusingly, simply attentively. The lavender rose faintly from her coat as she shifted. Purbright continued, still soft, still steady. "Mrs. Gillyforth, you once taught children, did you not?" A slight tremor ran through her fingers. "Many years ago," she said, "before my husband's illness." "You made small toys for them, I believe," Purbright added. "Handcrafted animals, birds, and embroidered initials onto their handkerchiefs so they wouldn't lose them." Glossop gasped, sensing a revelation, but uncertain its direction. Darch went rigid. Mrs. Gillyforth's voice was barely above a whisper. "I made small things, nothing elaborate." Purbright nodded. "But elaborate enough, I think, to cut a motif from a tapestry without damaging the surrounding weave." At this, Mrs. Gillyforth's breath caught. Not denial, but the quiet moment before one decides whether to continue resisting or simply let the truth exhale. Miss Fenn covered her mouth, horrified, though unsure at what. Purbright's tone softened further. "You recognized the motif, didn't you, before anyone else did?" She blinked rapidly. Once, twice, a third time. "It was the crest of a family you knew," Purbright continued. "A child you once taught, or someone connected to them. Someone whose secrets you believed should remain hidden." Darch inhaled sharply, his voice strained. "Are you implying—" Purbright held up a hand. "Not implying. Observing. This crest, the letter R, belongs to a family with its share of delicate history. Known to some in the town, not widely spoken of, certainly not something a public tapestry unveiling would benefit from." Darch's face coloured. "My mother never meant harm. Whatever the symbol meant to her, it's long forgotten." "Not forgotten," Purbright said gently. "Remembered quietly, and feared quietly." Mrs. Gillyforth's cup rattled in its saucer. Her voice, when it came, was small and trembling. "I didn't want the past dragged out, not for him." She nodded faintly toward Darch. "Your mother may have stitched the crest out of affection or remembrance, but others would not have viewed it so kindly." Darch stared at her, shocked but not wholly surprised. "You knew about that? About the argument 30 years ago? My grandmother? The inheritance? The accusations?" Mrs. Gillyforth closed her eyes. "I was your tutor. I knew more than I wished to. Your family was going through a very difficult time. I saw what it did to you, to your mother. She told me once that her stitching was a way to correct the story, to keep the parts she wished preserved." The tea-room held a hushed stillness. Purbright let the silence breathe before continuing. "And when the tapestry arrived here, with the crest still visible, you feared it would stir all that again." Mrs. Gillyforth nodded, tears trembling. "I thought, if I removed it quietly, no one would notice. But then Mrs. Glossop began poking about. People speculated. I panicked." "And the rearranged exhibits?" Purbright asked softly. She clasped her hands tightly. "I wanted to distract them, to make them talk about something else. I thought if I made the museum look unsettled, they'd forget the corner for a while. It was foolish. I didn't want to hurt anyone." Mrs. Glossop sputtered indignantly. "You manipulated the entire museum." "I didn't destroy a single thing," Mrs. Gillyforth said, with surprising steadiness. "I only moved them. I was desperate." Purbright nodded, acknowledging both the error and the honesty. "You left the motif in the library?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Somewhere quiet, somewhere gentle. I hoped the right person would find it." Darch exhaled long, slow, conflicted. "You should have told me." "You should have told us," Mrs. Glossop countered, forgetting her taste for secrets when not her own. Purbright lifted a hand again, calming the room. Mrs. Gillyforth acted out of fear, not malice. Fear of an old wound becoming public entertainment. Fear for someone she once taught and cared for. Gillyforth wiped her eyes. "I didn't know what else to do." Purbright leaned back, voice still mild. "The truth often comes out not through force, but through kindness. Your intentions were protective, misguided though they became." He allowed his gaze to settle firmly yet warmly upon her. "It is time, Mrs. Gillyforth, to let the past remain where it belongs, not hidden, but understood." No one spoke. The lavender in the air felt suddenly softer. Purbright folded his hands. "The matter will be resolved quietly. No charges, no scandal, but the tapestry will need careful restoration and full disclosure to the committee, properly phrased." Darch nodded slowly. "I can live with that." Mrs. Glossop opened her mouth to object, but Miss Fenn touched her arm gently, and for once Glossop allowed silence to win. Purbright rose, smoothing his jacket. "Thank you all. Truth seldom arrives loudly, but it always arrives." And in the quiet that followed, the last frayed threads of the mystery finally settled into place. In the days that followed, Flaxborough settled back into its customary rhythm with the faintly embarrassed air of a town that had made far more fuss than the occasion truly warranted. The tapestry, now temporarily removed from display, rested in a quiet conservation room, awaiting a gentle restoration that would discreetly omit its contentious crest. The committee, chastened but visibly relieved, resumed its work with the exaggerated politeness of people who had discovered, quite unexpectedly, that their grievances could be outdone by real sentiment. Mrs. Gillyforth, though not exonerated or even fully forgiven, found herself treated with a peculiar tenderness by those who understood something of the past she had tried to protect. Miss Fenn brought her a modest bouquet of chrysanthemums, murmuring that mistakes made with good intentions are often still good in their way. Mrs. Glossop, perhaps sensing the limits of triumph, confined her indignation to a few choice comments delivered only to her closest confidants, none of whom hesitated to repeat every word across town. Mr. Harford, grateful that the scandal had petered out without damaging his museum's fragile reputation, busied himself reorganizing the displays with great solemnity. It took him 2 full days to return each object to its proper place, though he performed the task with such a sense of ceremony that one might have imagined he was restoring a national treasure rather than returning a hobby horse to its rightful corner. By the 3rd afternoon, the museum's hallways once again reflected their habitual orderliness. Visitors admired the Victorian clocks, the medieval coins, the small local fossils, and the linen samplers without any awareness of how recently these had been participants in a silent symbolic drama. Peace, that fragile but persistent habit of Flaxborough life, seemed willing to resume its seat at every table. Inspector Purbright, for his part, moved through the town with his usual quiet presence. He listened calmly to the fragments of gossip that drifted toward him, some sincere, some embellished, some wildly inaccurate, but charming in their confidence. It was widely believed that he had solved the matter through arcane detective brilliance. Others suggested he had merely waited for the guilty conscience of the perpetrator to defeat itself. Both theories amused him equally. He visited the museum once more, not for investigation but for observation. The rearranged gallery had been restored, the steam engine once again sat beneath appropriate signage, the mourning brooch returned to its velvet cushion, the kestrel stood without glove or humiliation. Nothing remained to suggest the gallery's strange nocturnal transformation, except perhaps a faint memory in the air, like a whisper that had found its rightful rest. Purbright paused before the tapestry's temporary absence. The empty wall felt curious, lighter somehow, as though relieved of the burden of secrecy. He folded his hands behind his back, thinking how often small domestic symbols concealed far larger histories. Human life, he reflected, was stitched not merely with affection, but with pride, fear, loyalty, and the occasional desperate attempt to rewrite the untidy parts. A soft step sounded behind him. "I suppose it looks rather bare without it," said Mr. Darch quietly. Purbright turned, offering a gentle nod. "It will return soon enough. Its absence may do the town some good." Darch gave a tired smile. "I didn't realize how much of the past I'd been carrying, or how much Mother tried to soften it in her own way." "People mend with what tools they have," Purbright said. "Your mother used a needle. Others use silence. And sometimes silence becomes heavier than the thing it's meant to protect." Darch looked thoughtfully at the blank wall. "Mrs. Gillyforth meant well?" "Yes," Purbright said, and her concern, however misdirected, spoke more of loyalty than of meddling. "Fear rarely makes us tidy." They shared a quiet moment before Darch took his leave, visibly relieved that no greater humiliation had come of the incident. Purbright remained a while longer, watching the sunlight shift across the empty wall. Outside, Flaxborough was easing itself into late afternoon. The bakery released the comforting scent of warm loaves. The post office queue progressed with its usual combination of resignation and ceremony. The high street hummed with familiar greetings. Life was returning to its usual pattern, though beneath its threads ran the faint, persistent memory of a crest removed, a room rearranged, and the quiet ways people defend the stories they cannot bear to see retold. As Purbright walked toward the station, Sergeant Love hurried up beside him. "Sir," Love began breathlessly, People are saying you solved the whole case without so much as raising your voice." "People often say things, Sergeant," Purbright replied. "Accuracy is not their foremost concern." Love chuckled. "Still, sir, it's impressive. I wouldn't have noticed half what you did." Purbright smiled mildly. "And you must learn to notice not only what people say, but what they do not say, and what they arrange, or rearrange." Love nodded solemnly, though it was unclear whether he felt enlightened or politely baffled. They reached the station where a modest pile of paperwork awaited Purbright's return. Letters, reports, routine matters of minor mischief, each infinitely less dramatic than the speculation circulating across town. He took his seat, adjusted his papers, and dipped his pen into the inkwell with the calm satisfaction of a man reacquainting himself with familiar domestic duties. The afternoon sunlight drifted lazily across his desk. Outside, a distant dog barked. Somewhere down the road, a bicycle bell chimed, and from the museum, no doubt, came the determined rustle of Harford reorganizing something that had already been reorganized twice. Life, Purbright reflected, resumed exactly as it must, quietly, politely, with a hint of relief that things were once again precisely as dull as they ought to be. He signed the next document with his customary elegance, placed it neatly on the finished stack, and allowed himself a small, private smile. The tapestry would hang again some day, its missing corner repaired by skilled hands, its contentious crest removed without ceremony. And perhaps, as visitors admired its intricate flowers and delicate birds, they would wonder why such care had been taken with such an unassuming piece. But only Purbright, and a few others, would know that its most interesting story had never been stitched into the cloth at all. It had been woven quietly among the people who cared far too much, far too politely, and far too humanly about what it might reveal. He straightened the next form in his pile, dipped his pen again, and resumed his gentle work. And with that, life in Flaxborough drifted on, unpicked and rearranged, precisely as it always had been. The end.